organizing this. So despite my dissertation and the NAU specialty with Biber and 𝗪𝗪 𝗪𝗧𝗪 and so on of corpus linguistics and those studies, this talk is actually kind of a spin-off from that dissertation work. So I'm in what I'm collecting for my dissertation, I kind of went a step beyond the traffic stops. But this was just a topic that was there, and it wasn't being really provided in a way that could be taught to English language learners, and it really, really does need to be. So this was sort of the side project. There was just a gap that was kind of next to me. And Claudia and some of the visiting scholars here at Northern Arizona last year heard me give a talk at our local TESOL conference about some lesson plans I developed for beginning level English language learners, so students mostly from a refugee background here in Arizona. I had some lesson plans to try to teach them traffic stops. And then for today, I'm kind of giving the talk that led up to that. A bit about my background and kind of situating this topic in applied linguistics generally, and then the field of forensic linguistics, and I'll give an overview of that because it's actually a bit confusing even to me. And then sort of a description of traffic stops, which lead up to those lesson plans I talked about last year. So the lesson plans won't be the focus of it, nor will corpus linguistics or anything. But in addition to briefly talking about my background, I would like to spend a little time kind of situating it in those fields. I know last year I heard Tony give a talk here, and there were a couple of introductory slides just about the corpus linguistics as a field. And I learned so much in about, I'd say, 5 minutes from those first few slides because I was missing some big picture pieces. So we'll start with that, talk about traffic stops from different perspectives, and then the language of traffic stops. So you already heard more than you wanted to hear about my background, but basically I was one of those EFL teachers, which I'm sure you can find in Brazil. I went to kind of a rural place in Korea, and I didn't have much training at all, just a very little bit of practice from my undergraduate days. And I was actually pretty good at figuring out how to teach just by working hard and trying it day after day. And through not having training, not having a teacher who gave me some perspective, I came to believe that things like the tasks, focusing on the tasks that those students I had would actually need to do was really important. So I was interested in pragmatics and how they were actually getting those tasks done, and the tasks they actually needed to do, and then the authenticity of tasks and texts, which can be kind of a problematic word. But where I was working, those are things they didn't really pay attention to. So when I eventually came to study, those were the things that really motivated me to want to learn more. So that led me to fields like task-based language teaching, where we don't focus primarily on language. And there's some proponents that define this differently, but in the way that I learned it, you understand the task as something that the language user, the learner, needs to do, and they need to use language in order to do that. But the task is the thing that they're really learning how to do. And in order to define those tasks really well, to figure out what they are, and then to actually describe the language that needs to be done, that's how I arrived at register and corpus linguistics as ways to figure out what those tasks are. And kind of paradoxically, that perspective or that viewpoint led me to take the kind of broad view of applied linguistics. so there's sort of a narrow view of applied linguistics, how it originally started, where it's language teaching, learning, and testing. And there are a great set of articles in applied linguistics in 2015 talking about the history and future of the field. And so Tim McNamara made a distinction between that sort of original view of language teaching, where it's about language education, and it might also be related to something else, but that's kind of the point of what applied linguistics is. And that was sort of the origin story for our field. And some people work, only in language education or have that view today. But then there's a broader view, which is that applied linguistics is just the study of language anywhere that it makes sense, anywhere that applying language is going to help solve some kind of problem or some issue. I'm sure you're all familiar with this. So the US International Association, LAEL, has that in their mission statement. AILA or ILA has that in their mission statement as well. And one of those 2015 articles in applied linguistics from Guy Cook said that this viewpoint, it gives you a definition that it's so broad that it opens the door to an almost limitless variety of areas. So if we say that that's applied linguistics, that could mean almost anything. Tim McNamara had it a little more focused, where he said it's a broad and ever-increasing range of language-related real-world problems. And then Roger Shai, in the same edition, kind of embraced it and said that's what we should be doing. Look in the newspaper for issues that are happening. And that's where you should go and try to apply linguistics. And he had some sort of suggestions in that article, among which were identify and celebrate the areas of the real world where there's a need to apply linguistics. Start with low-hanging fruit, so the areas where you can easily apply linguistics. Creatively overcome problems of finding new areas of language data. So if the data is hard to get, we can be creative and get it. Linguistics should be applied there. So that's sort of the broad view of applied linguistics that I arrived at, or I was drawn toward. And right after I came back from teaching in those various places, I returned home to see if I could be an ESL, an EFL teacher in my hometown where I came from. And there were a couple of incidents pretty shortly after I came back. I don't know if people will be familiar. One was the Trayvon Martin case. So this was a teenager in Florida who was basically brutally murdered by someone who kind of aspired to be a police officer who wasn't. It was a very clear injustice where the person was acquitted, and that sparked off protest in places like my neighborhood where this really hadn't happened before. So kind of injustice that we've had for a long, long time. And that sparked something. It was sort of a watershed case that kind of sparked a change, or it reached more people. It got a lot more media attention. And not too long after that, in our sort of rival city, St. Louis, there was another case with a teenager, Michael Brown, and a similar case. And that it was just in a place that was really, really similar to where I had grown up. And all the people around me were not believing that it could happen where we lived. And people were outraged, but there wasn't any progress. No one was learning something more about it. So to me, it was obvious that that was a thing that needed to be addressed. So in linguistics, in applying linguistics, the field where we do that is forensic linguistics. And it's also pretty hard to define. And this is a thing people are more often not familiar with. So just like the sort of applied linguistics overview, for forensic linguistics, there's a narrow view where we treat language as evidence. You think of a forensic scientist as on the crime show, the person that's getting fingerprints or matching DNA or blood samples or something. So language is one of those pieces of evidence that we can work with. Things like authorship attribution, feature identification and comparison, or the sort of big umbrella terms that we'll talk about. So in a very, very narrow definition, forensic linguistics means doing just that. You work for the FBI or something, you're using language as part of an investigation or as evidence, in most cases as an expert testifying in court. But there's also a broader view where forensic linguistics includes any intersection of language and the law. So it could be those true forensic linguistic practices like authorship, attribution. There's forensic phonology, trying to identify who is speaking on an undercover recording. Someone was wearing a wire. But there are also many, many other important aspects of that intersection of language and the law. So Roger Shy, who was one of those authors of the Applied Linguistics articles in 2015, he's also really, really well known for forensic linguistics. So in treating language as evidence, he worked on the case of the Unabomber in the US. This was a criminal who sent bombs through the mail in the 1990s with sort of a cryptic letter. And Shy and some other people were able to identify him through a particular word he used for the median, which is like the grass or the sort of pavement in the middle of the street where traffic is going in either direction. And there's a little box or some trees or something in the middle. So this person had a really, really particular word for that. And they were also able to identify where he'd gone to college. So Shy is doing some of that true forensic linguistics, but he also defines crime. So if you think of the crime of bribery, when you're paying someone off to do something for you, that crime only happens in the moment in which you agree to do that. So in order to understand what that crime is, we need a linguist. We need to define that in terms of language. And we could also use that for things like defining hate speech and so on. More recently, you might know Jesse Egbert, my advisor at NAU. He and many others are working on what they'll call language in the law, which is how linguistic analysis interacts with legal interpretation. So this is working with lawyers and judges to interpret laws which might be very old or which might be ambiguous. So in a courtroom, we need to determine what that meaning is. And we can use especially corpus linguistics to support that analysis. So there are lots of great areas in the intersection of language and the law, but none of them yet deal with the intersection of language and law enforcement, which is what I'm noticing is a great need in our society, at least around me. So it's sort of unclear who gets to use this term forensic linguistics, who gets to use the term language in the law. But all of those are people that are working in this area. So as relates to law enforcement, as opposed to legal interpretation for judges, as opposed to defining crimes, as opposed to doing actual investigative work, we can study law enforcement officers or police officers and their interactions with citizens. So a really well-developed area, you might be familiar with this, is interrogations, as they're called in the US, and interviews, as they're often called maybe in the UK, Australia, or somewhere else. So there's a lot of discourse analytic work in this area. So Georgina Hayden ran the last conference for the forensic linguists, the IAFL, the International Association. She has, I'll hold it up, I don't know if we can see, she has sort of a classic book in that area, drawing from a corpus. There's a brand new book as well, Marianne Mason. So this book just came out. So a really active area of research, especially in the discourse of those interviews. We also think about audience design in the way that there's always sort of a third audience there. When you're interrogating a suspect, you always have in mind someone listening to a recording or this coming up later in a court trial, future implications. So people work on that from the perspective of audience design. There really is a dearth of, in this area of law enforcement and language, thinking about actual L2, people using an additional language. So there are a few studies, but these will do things like survey police officers in Jordan or Turkey on what they think their needs are for learning English as tourist police or to work with foreigners. So there are also from Nigeria, also from Spain, there's some small kind of obscure studies in this way. And the area where it's really starting to grow is in understanding of the police caution. In the US, it's called the Miranda warning from a famous court case. So Anita Pavlenko and Scott Jarvis and some other researchers, including a couple of MA students from here at Northern Arizona, have been working in that area recently in the last year or two. And for the US case anyway, with the Miranda warning, basically L1 English speakers, native English speakers cannot come close to fully understanding what that warning means. And police officials are actually really well trained about how to kind of meet the legal requirement for that, having provided that warning, so that anything a suspect or a person they're talking to says will be admissible as evidence. So that's kind of the state of L2 research on language and law enforcement. Likewise, there's some sort of obscure writing on the literacy of police officers or what happens in things like police reports. And part of that is an article from Malcolm Coulthard in the mid-1990s, which was sort of the basis, or that research effort was the basis of the requirement for audio recording police interviews, which previously were transcribed by another police officer. And so Coulthard kind of helped to show why that was a problem. So my dissertation work, I'm really, really interested in getting at those troubling issues that we were actually seeing between citizens and police on the street. And in the US in general, I think we can be proud of law enforcement. So Claudia, for example, and another visiting scholar were here with us last semester. And they remarked on, we would walk home at night from class or from somewhere, and they would remark on the dark street and how they would never be caught alone or in a small group walking on that dark street at home. So there's sort of an element of trust in law enforcement and of safety that we have that is something I think we should really value. And there's clearly something systematically going wrong where there are these kind of horrible cases. So I want to get at that data, which I'm drawing from videos that I gather online. So these are things that some researchers call police-citizen interactions. And traffic stops can be a part of those interactions, but I'm really looking at something much bigger. So traffic stops are actually somewhat researched. This is a budding area of research. So there's a critical discourse study of kind of another horrible incident where someone was killed. But there are a couple of corpus studies, dissertation in criminology, and then a research group at Stanford that are starting to look at the linguistic features of traffic stops. So that's sort of the state of research on traffic stops. And in my research and my dissertation, I'm trying to go a step beyond that. And there are a few other people that are just starting to do that. So Kate Steele is also a PhD student at Aston in the UK, looking at the language of response to domestic abuse calls. There's even a little bit possibly of interest to Brazil in the Portuguese-speaking world. So this was just kind of an analysis of police questioning of suspects, not in a formal interrogation in Mozambique. So there's some, we're starting to get into this area, but traffic stops are the area that are being well researched. So this, my research, I hope, is kind of going beyond that to police-citizen interactions more generally, but traffic stops are the things that are starting to be researched. So I have no idea if this image will horribly confuse you, if it will help kind of make things clear. But we're working within that green circle of forensic linguistics. And there are many areas that, depending on who you ask, kind of fall within this area of forensic linguistics or possibly don't. So we have language in the law, working with lawyers and judges. We have things like defining crimes, like what exactly is bribery, what exactly is hate speech. The work of Tammy Gales and Andrea Nini on stalking or malicious texts probably falls in the same area. It's possible that some could consider that not to be forensic linguistics, but it probably falls pretty squarely within forensic linguistics. So I'm not sure if this work on traffic stops properly belongs to that field or not. In my view, it does. So these interrogation researchers that I showed you, in the case of Hayden, we'll call it forensic linguistics. In the case of Marianne Mason, they'll call it language in the law / forensic linguistics. So that's where we are in the fields of applied linguistics and forensic linguistics. And to focus on traffic stops, this somewhat well-researched aspect of police-citizen interactions that English language learners really need to know. If you were here in Flagstaff with me, as people were at the 𝗕𝗏 conference when I first gave this talk, I would ask you how many of you drove here, and that would almost certainly be everybody, because we're very car-centric culture. It's kind of hard to get by without a car. If you're a visiting scholar, you might be able to do it for a month or so. I might also ask you how many of you committed at least one minor traffic violation on your way to the conference. And that would be all of you, because everyone is committing minor traffic violations all of the time. If you can think of yourself being not perfectly centered in the lane, not signaling a lane change, did you go under the minimum speed? Did you go over the maximum speed of 15 miles per hour on our campus? We're always committing these minor traffic violations. So everyone basically is always subject to traffic stops. In Arizona, where our state agency kind of famously doesn't have body cameras, which are used to record these interactions. So it's a bit of a scarier stop. It's kind of old-fashioned. They don't want it on record. The last year we have data available, they had just over 500,000 traffic stops, and over half of those resulted in some kind of citation, a ticket, or a warning. And a small percentage, but quite a few, resulted in some kind of arrest. Some researchers in law and in criminology think it's reasonable to estimate there are 100 million traffic stops in the US annually. So Arizona actually has quite few as compared to the US. So the overall point is these are happening all the time. And basically any of us are subject to this and almost any time we're in a car. So there are quite a few different views. We haven't researched this well yet from the perspective of linguists or applied linguists or forensic linguists. But legal scholars will tell you we're interested in routine traffic stops, and routine can mean that it's sort of a regular course of procedure, not out of the ordinary. No one did wrong, no one was killed, anything like that. But at the same time, this means that it's a carefully rehearsed act. So it's, we can think of institutional discourse, someone with power, someone who has very carefully rehearsed what they're going to say, has some specific goals. And within the routine traffic stop, those can escalate. So they can search a person, they can search a vehicle, and they need either the consent of the person who's being searched or some kind of probable cause, like they see a bag of heroin in the back seat, or they think they see a body, or they see something wrong. But you'll note that if an officer asks you for your consent to search the car and you refuse, we could consider that probable cause to search. So basically, if the official stopping you sees some reason they would want to search you or doesn't trust you for some reason, they basically have this legal right to do that. There's no real way to stop that. And there are many results of the traffic stop, many legal results, which could be a warning, just letting you go with a warning, no problem. It could be a ticket or a citation. It could be a summons to go to court to answer for your breaking the law. And it could be up to arrest. And unlike in other cases, an official arresting you at a traffic stop, like this is unreviewable, so it's not something that can be overturned. The officials, the police officers actually at this traffic stop will have a very different view. So some of these officials actually don't think that this should really be part of their job. Even those who do see that maybe solidly as part of their job will have a range of attitudes. So some who actually sort of enjoy doing it, but there are quite a few officials that don't really want to be doing that work. And depending on the department or where you are, people here all the time will hear about quotas. So there'll be more traffic stops at the end of the month if officers are trying to make a quota. There are also coordinated crackdowns on big travel times or times that might be dangerous, at risk for drunk driving, and so forth. And there is some research in criminology on the viewpoints of officers. So legally, nothing is restricting them from using the traffic stop as a pretext for some other investigation. If they think I am trafficking drugs, if they think I'm doing something they don't like, a traffic stop can be used as the way to get at me. But this, whether or not officials will do that, is kind of mediated by a specific reason they might have to be after me before creating a traffic stop. It'll be mediated by things like their attitude at them, their attitude towards traffic stops, their mood at the moment, or if they have any particular pet peeves, like people who weave between lanes or people who turn on their turn signal at the last moment. So they're really, the stop is at the discretion of the officer, but it's really at the discretion of the officer. So whether or not they search you, what the outcome of the stop will be, and so on. So our big picture here is that officials don't really like doing this. They need to do it as part of their job, and there's sort of a range. It's very up to the personality, to the discretion of the official, what might happen and why. So from all the research that we have on traffic stops from the official view and from policy, we know that all of these things here are actually the goals of an official during the traffic stop. So if they pull you over, they might not want to enforce a penalty such as giving you a ticket, sending you to court, or they might. But to justify the stop, they need to get an admission of wrongdoing. So this is their first goal. But at the same time, they have the goal of getting a records check. So they need to validate things like your driver's license, your registration, your insurance. They have the public safety obligation. They want to find out who you are by virtue of interacting with you, and what you're doing, where you might be going, where you might be coming from, which is something that would give them a reason to investigate further. So all of those are kind of a complicated set of goals that officials are engaging in, really with any traffic stop. So language researchers, not surprisingly, have a very different view of that. 𝗏𝗏𝗋 et al. Are the Stanford researchers. So they're working with, I believe, from the year 2014. I don't know which year. They have a full month of all the traffic stops from the city of Oakland, California, which has a troubled police department. Large Black communities, there have been a lot of incidents there. So that department provided an entire month of traffic stops from the city. And they've identified a number of different features with the overall message that the level of perceived respect and the level of formality and the interaction are the things that are making or that are associated with procedural justice, which is the goal. We want a fair outcome for the citizen, but formality doesn't work with that in the way that you might think. Lowry-Kinberg is the dissertation, again with traffic stops from the city of Spokane, Washington. And in her dissertation, she found that this sort of rapport building or rapport structured communication worked really well. That had more positive outcomes at the traffic stop. People perceived more respect. There were less, fewer incidents or troubling outcomes. But you could be, the official that is, could be overly differential or overly authoritative, and it didn't work as well. So just being really nice actually has a negative outcome on this traffic stop. Likewise, being overly authoritative has the same problem. When we think about respect and rapport building, I don't know if you're familiar with Taman's book, Conversational Style. So she talks about the porcupine that needs affection too. So there's sort of this problem of for rapport and for establishing a good relationship, we need intimacy. So you need closeness and familiarity with someone, but you also need this certain distance. So you can think of, for example, positive and negative face. But when we think of that rapport building style, it's really striking the balance between those two things. So beyond that sort of respect and formality, we know in critical discourse studies from some of the troubling incidents, we know that questions coming from the citizen are really disrupting this institutional discourse pattern. There's sort of an assertion of power coming from the official. So the citizen talks, you have this, ideally this sort of building of rapport. But the citizen really asking questions at all, and particularly kind of challenging direct questions, will disrupt that and kind of result in have a very negative outcome. And finally, we know a little bit about the moves that officials follow, which is never what the procedure dictates, never exactly what they're supposed to do. So this is a study. Interestingly, this is from Northern Virginia, so the Washington, D.C. area. This happened during my master's program. While I was there, something that I was interested in that I did not know about until recently, researching this presentation. Without going into too much detail, we can see that this researcher went on a series of ride-alongs with police officers. So you can sign up with an agency to ride in a car with an officer for a day. And they did an ethnography. So they just observed all these traffic stops. They were in the background. And what we see in 1 through 16 is the policy. So this is what they're trained to do, or what the department dictates that they should do. You'll notice something like introducing themselves at the beginning. So the officer actually introducing themselves is not happening all the time, which is certainly surprising. Something like asking where you keep your license and registration is never actually happening. So by training, I didn't even know this, you should not take out your license and your registration if you're pulled over. You should wait to be directed. They should ask you where it's kept and so on. This sort of minimizes the uncertain movements of the motorists. So despite the training, that's not happening at all. All of these other elements here, asking for documents, asking for particular information about the citizen, the driver, giving an explanation, all of these elements are happening sort of intermittently or at the officer's judgment or discretion. So these moves, these steps in the interaction are not consistently happening, except for providing an explanation, which is a key part of them getting sort of an admission of guilt. Without needing really to spend time on this, you might know that a citizen, such as yourself, in a traffic stop would like to get out of there as quickly as possible and as safely as possible. You might want to dispute the claim of the officer. You might want to acknowledge it. So these are actually different goals that happen sometimes. And we know that from skilled, especially native English speakers, there's a successful move that can be done where you're preempting the officer's sort of institutional sequence. Some of you might have seen this. I know I've seen it in some of my family members, where an official will walk up to the car, and you might say, "Officer, I'm so sorry. I'm late for church. I have this role at church, and we have to be there in 5 minutes." Or I have to get my son from school. I'm so sorry. I know I shouldn't have done it, but I'm worried about my son. So you're kind of acknowledging and giving a reason for this behavior, and people can actually successfully preempt. You might not be surprised to learn that L2 speakers find traffic stops very frightening. So I've done kind of some informal needs analysis for classes, things that weren't published projects or anything. And everyone that I talked to, this was a frightening thing for them in the US. Wherever you are now, sure you can imagine driving in another country. I know some of our visitors here have had traffic stops. Certainly, I know when I've been in another country, I've been too terrified to drive. So that's sort of the citizen view of traffic stops. So we can see that the traffic stops are actually really problematic. So they're arbitrary. They're really at the discretion of the officer whether they pick you out for some minor violation that everyone is always doing. Yet they're necessary. We need someone to kind of be enforcing these laws to have some kind of order on the road. The sort of concept of respect, just like in any communication, is also a dilemma where we need that sort of intimacy and familiarity, but we also need a certain distance. For my purposes as a researcher, we have an issue of data where the videos that we're likely to have access to online, the types of thing that we can usually research are going to be those that are controversial or problematic in some way. So for the Stanford researchers, for example, they had a wonderful agreement. They had a month of data from this agency. They're working hand in hand with that police agency and with the local government. But in general, that data is sort of a dilemma too, because we're not getting the typical routine successful interactions. We'll notice that the goals are a dilemma where the officials have a really complex set of goals. They need an admission of guilt, but they also need to accomplish these other tasks where citizens will have sort of divergent goals. And for L2 learners, if you're trying to learn traffic stops in Portuguese, new to Brazil, if you're trying to learn them in English here in Arizona, hopefully that's happening very, very, very rarely where you're involved in that. The actual interactions you're going to be able to listen to or see are pretty rare as well. They're going to be probably from the more controversial or more problematic set, the videos that typically get shared. They're not the only ones. But so having that actual data available to learners is also sort of a dilemma for us. Also, the more successful you are at traffic stops, at talking your way out of them, at smoothly navigating this communication, probably the more, the greater proficiency, the greater fluency you have in English. So that kind of disadvantages these learners as well. So this data is not, it's not original research, but it's drawing from these researchers who've worked with traffic stops. It's also drawing from traffic stops that are in my dissertation data. So these are things I've gathered online. I excluded quite a lot, so I'm not going after the most controversial ones. But just in transcribing them, these are things that I noticed. If you've had occasion to be pulled over at a traffic stop, or if you've seen videos of these in some ways, maybe on a sitcom, think about these phrases here, these things that you've heard or seen. And probably they are. So something like any weapons is probably at a step of escalation. Maybe I don't look like someone who would carry a weapon around with me all the time. But each one of these is probably a common phrase that you hear. So do me a favor is a really interesting expression. Even with my advisors, I found I had to explain this, and in watching an interaction, it felt very natural. Yet the use is quite peculiar. So first of all, it's not asking for a favor, for a small task that you could do that's helpful to me. This is actually a pre-request. It's a preamble to usually a more difficult request. So this will be said before handcuffing someone during an arrest. Or if during a traffic stop, if someone looks non-compliant, like you might not provide your license, you might not be giving some information that's needed. This is sort of a pre-request for something that might be kind of a troubling request. Yet we're hearing it in almost every traffic stop that I'm seeing. So we have these sort of key phrases just that I'm noticing. We might be able to do lexical bundle or formulaic language or routine research and identify more of these things. But these are genre marker types that are sticking out. So under that umbrella of respect, where a lot of the discourse researchers are thinking about what makes a successful traffic stop, we can identify quite a few features. So there's a lot of gratitude, a lot of apologizing, these soften sort of requests and providing difficult information. So I'm sorry, but I'm sorry that happened to you. Thank you for complying, and so forth. This makes perfect sense. Quite a lot of hedging, especially with the adverbial just, is not at all surprising. With vocatives, with the way that we use titles, this is quite surprising. So the Stanford researchers found that those traffic stops that were rated more respectful are not using formal titles. So things like sir or ma'am, things like your last name, Mr. Berber, Mr. Sardina, excuse me. These are less respectful. So when that type of language is happening, it's associated independently with less respectful traffic stop. So informal titles, things like man, bro, dude, are associated with these more respectful interactions, also use of the first name. Other features are probably predictable. They're more familiar, more conversational. So filled pauses, the elision and reduced forms, and phonological slurring. So don't you, reduced to don't-cha. Wanna, gonna, these sort of reduced forms. Also word shortening when you can do that. So okay instead of okay. All kind of reflecting this more respectful interaction, more familiarity, and so on. You can also identify some of the things we might have seen on the previous slide. So providing an explanation is respectful. You can use circumlocution, so you can avoid mentioning a punishment. Not in any way directly say that I'm giving you a ticket, but actually giving you the ticket. And then reframing your decision as a favor, not surprisingly, using an expression like, do me a favor. Profanity is an important feature. So we can see profanity going both ways. Actually, it's usually kind of functioning to build rapport. So this is actually a feature that we should want people to be using, and we should want English language learners to be recognizing. I thought the perfect example from that Stanford study was, yeah, it sucks, I know. So you're accommodating the citizen's viewpoint, right? You're acknowledging their perspective, not letting them off the hook. But that profanity is sort of reducing the power barrier and the punishment that you've just leveled at them. But likewise, profanity, of course, can be an escalation. So if you're in a pretty authoritative interaction, difficult situation, this phrase "right fucking now" seems to be a just like "do me a favor," something that's occurring in all of those interactions that escalate. So possibly something that's trained. There are also some particular idioms for traffic stops. So if an official lit you up, this is when they turn their lights on and drove behind you. They'll talk about throwing the book at you, flying through the intersection, and so forth. So these seem like pretty standard idioms, or I guess a metaphor for the case of fly through the intersection. But these are things we might identify as formulas or bundles, possibly in the traffic stop. They're being really, really frequently used, and so forth. So there are more sort of features that we can identify within these traffic stops. I'd just like to kind of show you brief examples from some of the traffic stops, and I've talked for way too long. So here's from a traffic stop that resulted in an arrest, which was later overturned. So it's sort of a controversial traffic stop. Take a second and see if you can identify any of those features we just talked about. And I accidentally showed you the ones that I highlighted. So we can see the more formal vocative man. We can see "do me a favor" here towards the end. We can see some of these sort of standard phrases that are being used. Let us, that won't work. So we'll use that example to highlight a few of those features that we were working with. So as I mentioned, this presentation was originally to share some lesson plans with TESOL, with community ESL teachers here in Arizona. So these are the lesson plans that I actually came up with. I'm in the process of reworking those. So in our local community in Tucson, there are some researchers who are actually brilliant with the beginning level adult ESL education, especially for learners from a refugee background. So drawing on what I learned from them, I've been reworking these lessons. So you can see the sort of documents, how do you handle the documents, your license registration, and so forth. Elements of the car and road, which some pretty specific vocabulary will come up, like your particular lights, your turn signal, and so forth. And then we'll build up to understanding some of those key phrases, some of the idioms, and so forth. And then finally to understanding some of those more complex respect markers, things like the profanity, things like how you might respond to avoid asking a question, and recognizing the pattern of what officials are doing. So I talked for way too long, but that is my overview of traffic stops. So this is sort of a step before my dissertation data, which I hope to cover police-citizen interactions more generally. But there's definitely a big need and a big opportunity to take traffic stops, a small part of police-citizen interactions, which are a little bit better researched, and to make sure that we're teaching those well to especially our beginning adult English learners here.
All right. Yes, thank you, Tyler. We have a few minutes for questions. I believe we have some there in the Q&A. Can you see them, Tyler, at the Q&A at the bottom?
The last message I have is from you.
No, next to the messages.
Yes.
Q&A.
I thought that's what I did. Oh, I apologize. Okay.
Can you see them?
I can see them now. I'm
Okay,
sorry.
good.
I wish I had known that while I was yammering on. Would have been better.
It's cool. No problem.
Traffic stop interaction variations as affected by the gender or age of the participants. So the Stanford researchers, I think, are moving in that direction. They wanted to take on race because first, and I'm not up on everything they've done. I think they have a large research group. They're kind of frequently coming out with reports. But just people of color sort of systematically being treated unfairly, even if we don't think the individuals interacting with them are racist or bad or what have you. Possibly they are. Not everyone is that way, but we clearly have a systematic problem. So in some of the critical discourse research on the traffic stops, we're talking about aspects of identity, and as is the case kind of with critical discourse, we can claim based on what we know, for example, about gender, that this is playing out in the traffic stop, but not in a sort of systematic way. I think we just haven't addressed it that well yet. There might be something more in sociology or in the legal research, but not in a convincing way that would tell us about language. Anecdotally, I have one of the texts I gathered is this just wonderful woman who must be about 75 years old, who's trying to flirt her way out of a ticket and possibly worse from this this young handsome officer. So I'm afraid that's about as far as it's gone with age. But the answer is basically no or not enough. There's really not that research enough. So the likelihood for PCI misunderstandings is quite, between L2 drivers and an officer, is quite big. How linguistically trained or aware would officers be to deal with them? That's kind of down to the officer. There are videos of people not doing well, calling for a translator, sitting on the shoulder of a highway, waiting 20, 30 minutes for a translator to arrive. Just kind of an awful thing to watch. I know our local police here are quite good about this, and I've observed them in person being, very accommodating. Departments often have training, so providing training for police is a big industry. A lot of consultants are making the big bucks off this. So depending on how much an officer has done, hopefully they would do pretty well. But then those that are doing the traffic stops are much less likely to be the highly trained officials. So it's kind of down to chance, unfortunately, I think. Hey, Daisy. Daisy says, how did you collect the data for traffic stops? So I had, for my dissertation, I identified all the jurisdictions in a number of states. Believe it or not, Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, Utah, Nevada, Texas, and California. I didn't end up needing to gather from Texas and California, but I did systematic searches using, for example, Coconino County and Flagstaff and police and sheriff and so forth. Just looking for any video that was shared, if it was a police body camera that was shared, or a cell phone recording from a citizen, or any video that was shared in some way. I gathered them systematically. I excluded, there are certain groups that go around, they'll try to provoke the police, and they have their own sort of network. So there's some things that were excluded, but I gathered videos in that way. So the traffic stops that I'm familiar with were gathered as systematically as possible from what's available online, which has obviously its disadvantages, but no one is yet tapping that data, not in a corpus, not as a group. And those other really good corpus studies, again, are just drawing from a single city in a single time period. Cool. So the thing about this isn't actually yet my dissertation research. This is just something I noticed. There's research that exists on the traffic stops more than there does for police-citizen interactions generally. And as I'm transcribing them or as I'm looking at them, I know that phrase is just so important because it's happening in like every single interaction, and it's not how you would use this in normal use. So from like a corpus linguistic perspective, I actually don't know. I should be like collaborating with people and getting a much better knowledge about the traffic stops specifically. It could be only one occurrence, an idiosyncratic. It could be something like a politeness marker, especially as, as like a pre-request, but it seems to be with a particular type of request. And that's a really weird politeness marker to use. Why wouldn't they just say please? Why is it they would need this different sort of politeness marker? And I was talking with my advisor, Jesse, about this sort of phenomenon with profanity, but I wonder if we might find something like in the more problematic, the more authoritative interactions, if we're seeing that kind of reoccurring. So maybe it's, even though it's sort of a pre-request politeness marker, possibly, maybe it's sort of marking this ramping up of the interaction. But either way, I don't think it's not like a stylistic thing, not just a one-off, some officials doing that, it's their quirk. It does seem to be happening all the time, even if only once. And I probably need to turn over to Viana. So are there any study about discourse and negotiations for the release of hostages? There is one single study, which is, I will reply to you with an answer to that. I will have to look up what that study is, but I will, I can chat individually, can I not, to Rosario? Okay, I'll go ahead and do that. So sorry, I overstepped the time here. Thank you all so much for letting me talk at you.